Well, hello and welcome to our fourth segment about how to use the crop budget and leasing tool. In this video segment, I will be talking about how to run simulations. All right, well, if you guys remember our previous Excel budgeting tools from last year, we had a bunch of sensitivity tables that would help you show where your break-even price was and what the returns were for a given range of prices and yields. And those are fine. They help show us some variability and risk. But the one issue is they don't really take account of the fact that some outcomes are likely to be more likely than other outcomes. And really to do that in a proper format, we really didn't need to do a Monte Carlo simulation where we can vary the yields and prices around the most common yield and prices and adjust for that likelihood of something occurring and actually see what the effect is on our net income for a producer. And that's what we're going to do with the simulation part. So this is in some ways, it's a much more advanced technique than what I have used in the past. And to do that, I'm just going to look at the base situation I had with the wheat and north center rotation, which means I'm going to get rid of the second budget I had in there. And to make sure everything matches to what I had when I first tried this thing out in practice, I'm going to reset everything back to what the original budget was. So remember, I told you guys that a quick way to get rid of all these overrides here instead of manually keying those back to blanks is basically just click this button right here, and that will automatically take away all those individual overrides, and I get back to the budget situation I had before. And again, I'm going to use kind of what the default value, what the program told me was that an equitable share range was 68%. So that'll be the percent I'm using when I run my simulations. Well, the way you do that is we need to go to our Flex Lease page. And this does several things. One, it looks at the ranges of yields and prices that show up for our crop. But we can also look at, in addition to looking at a share lease and a cash lease, this also has the capabilities of doing two types of flex leases. Now, there's really a whole bunch of different types of flex leases, things you can do. I just kind of did the first two simple ones to start with, but this is really an area that probably hasn't really been explored too much by ag economists, trying to find a tool that you can look at flex leases on and actually get some meaningful results back from. I think really the only way we really can do that without doing a bunch of simulation, without doing a bunch of tables and looking at different comparisons, is to do it through a simulation analysis like I'm doing. All right, so we need to do a simulation analysis. Well, and that involves a Monte Carlo process. Well, we're looking at things that are probably likely to be correlated. Now, simulations really aren't too bad if you just have a single thing you're trying to simulate. In fact, in the farm management class that I teach at K-State, I actually show students how you can take your own empirical data, and if you just have one thing you're looking at, it's pretty easy to do a Monte Carlo simulation if you just have one thing you're trying to simulate. Now, the reason why you can go out and spend big bucks on an Excel add-in that does simulations is that doing simulations when you have things that are correlated together becomes greatly much more difficult than what it would be just with a single item you're trying to simulate. That's why these companies that develop simulators where you can do things that are correlated together, that's why they're able to charge big dollars, is because the codes to incorporate the correlations correctly becomes very, very complicated. In fact, it took me quite a while to find code that I could actually modify to actually do what I'm doing here. And even then, I had to make a few assumptions in the simulation process. So one of the assumptions I had to make to get this to run somewhat easily within my program in Excel is I basically assume a triangular distribution, which basically, and that has some advantages to it as well. For one thing, it's much easier to specify because to do a triangular distribution, you basically need to specify a high point, a low point, and then a point in the middle. Now, I'm assuming that the point in the middle is the number that comes from the budget. So back in the budget, I had 50 bushel yield, you see here, and 550 price. And if I go back over here, you see those are kind of the defaults that show up here. So now what I need to do to get a range of what I might expect is I need to enter what's the highest yield I could expect, what's the lowest yield I could expect, and the same thing with the prices, okay? And that defines my triangular distribution. So you notice here this graph kind of shows you that already here. It shows you that I basically thought my highest yield was going to be 60, my lowest yield was 30, highest price 6, lowest price 3. and that shows up in my graph here. So again, we need to have our expected price in between the high and the low, and the same thing with the yields, the high between the high and the low, and the same thing with the prices between the high and the low. And again, if you had more than one crop you were looking at, we can simulate all those together. I'm just looking at one particular crop at the moment for this to kind of make this demonstration a little bit easier, but it's not. As you fill in more budgets over here in these slots here, then they will automatically populate over here. And then the next step then is to pick the correlation that we have between yields and prices. And this is where it may get a little bit tricky. I think Dan and I are going to have to go through and calculate some of those correlations between yields and prices, maybe for the last 10 or 15 years, kind of maybe for the state or region, and provide those for you guys to fill in here. It would be better, obviously, if you had your own yield history of prices and yields, that you could actually correlate those yourself. But for coming up in the future, we'll try to provide some numbers that you can use as the default. So with one crop, this correlation table is not too complicated, because you only have to calculate the correlation then between the yields and the prices. So we're assuming that there's probably some positive correlation, meaning that if yields go up, prices may go up a little bit too, or go down a little bit too. So we're assuming those to go together a little bit. Again, we'll give you some more real values to plug in there. I'm just assuming, kind of for this little example, there's a 0.2 correlation. And then the same thing with probably like corn, soybeans, you would expect normally a positive correlation between the yields, maybe not so much between the prices. So on and so forth. But you can see what happens as you get a whole bunch of different crops involved. This correlation table becomes quite big and a little bit unwieldy to really put everything in here, because not only are you looking for a correlation between the yields, but you're also looking for a correlation between price, and then a correlation between price and yields here. So that's why this table kind of gets pretty big pretty quickly here. But with just a single crop, you're only looking at the correlation between the yields and the prices. Now, if you put a 0 in, that basically assumes those are independent. Basically, you could assume simulate each one independently, and it doesn't you don't have to worry about any kind of interaction between the two here. But as long as there isn't either a negative or positive correlation, then you need to account for that appropriately. So I just stuck 0.2 in for the analysis. That doesn't mean this is the actual correlation. And in fact, it's probably not. Actually, it's probably going to be negative, I think, with a little bit negative, actually. But I'm just using positive 0.2 for my example. All right. And then maybe I should talk a little bit about how you can handle the different flex leases here, too. So again, there is an ability to hide and show all comments, like you see here, that kind of explains some of these things in a little greater detail. But again, you can see what if you're going to flex on price or flex on yield, you basically put what the base rent in is then, and then there's a couple ways you can go about doing the flexing thing. There, you can either have a lead crop, or you can look at all crops together. So if you want to have a lead crop, you would specify the number from up here at the top. Otherwise, put a 0 in it. We'll look kind of all crops together here. So again, a whole lot of different variations when it comes to the flexible lease part. And then the other part that may be kind of important is whether you allow for downward price adjustments. So, some landlords may say, well, I'm willing to go to a flex lease, but I don't want to allow for any kind of price, for my price actually going below that. So I may be willing to accept a lower overall base rent in exchange for flexing, but I don't want it to go below that. Another farmer was saying, I want a higher base rent, but then I'm willing to adjust my rent either both upwards or downwards. So if you want to allow for downward adjustment, you put a yes there. If you don't want downward adjustment, put a no there. Same thing on the yield side. You may want to adjust flexing for only higher yields, or maybe allow for flexing both upward or downward both here. So again, you can incorporate by doing it that way. And again, these are all the aspects you would have to fill in the blue box here. So here's our base price, our base yield that we're looking at in the contract. And if it's grayed out, that means there's nothing to fill in for that part of it. So with only one crop, you basically need a base price that goes into your contract and also a base yield for that. Okay, so that's just kind of a brief rundown for how you would do the flexing. Now, there's a whole bunch of other types of flexes too you could have. You can flex on revenue, other things. As I get more time and adjust the spreadsheet, I will add some of the other flexible leases as possible options in this as well here. All right, so once you got things the way you want it to look like you think it should be, you're ready to hit the run simulation button. Now this will run the VBA code that actually runs this. Again, at this point, make sure you have other spreadsheets closed because it will greatly affect the how long this thing takes to run. Even with just this one, well, I think I have actually one spreadsheet open on the side here, but I have a pretty fast computer too. So notice here as I click this, it starts to run. You think, well, is this thing actually working? So just be patient. It will eventually get to the end, and you'll see it here because this little window will pop up, and it will say that it has into 200 iterations, and it took basically about 5 seconds for this thing to run. You'll notice here, then it automatically takes you to this output page here. So I switched from the Flex Lease to the output as it actually ran. You notice so there was also a box how many iterations you could put out. I had this hard coded right now to stay at 200 no matter what you put in here right now. Eventually, as I get some of the kinks worked out in the speed, I may allow you to actually change that. But that was just kind of thinking ahead for future iterations of this spreadsheet. All right, so then now we're to the output page. So I'm going to have a separate video explaining this because interpreting CDFs may require a little practice. I'm not sure how many of you guys have actually seen these. If you've looked at the Texas A&M Farm Build tool, they tend to use these quite a bit here, but I will have a separate video actually explaining the output.